Chapter 9. Adam Hibbs? Did you hear that? Q whispered in Matt's ear. He's Adam Hibbs. Matt shot a glance at Tony and Hooter, who were both staring at the young rebel. Tony looked at Matt and his mouth dropped open. Matt tried to smile. If it's the same Adam Hibbs, then he'll know about the lake and the rowboat, and he can tell us how to get back. Matt leaned over and whispered to his comrades. If that's the same Adam Hibbs, Q said, his voice beginning to go from a low whisper to a high squeak. If that's the same Adam Hibbs, what's he still doing here? A cold, sobering feeling filled Matt's entire body. He looked back up at Adam Hibbs, who nodded knowingly in his direction. The way the man stared at him, Matt was certain he was the same Adam Hibbs. Before he had a chance to think any further on the subject, Matt's attention was diverted to another matter. They had finally reached the other side of the river, and the long Durham boat was guided out of the tangle of ice and came to rest on solid ground. There was an eerie quiet as the soldiers poured out of the boats, silently clutching their muskets. No words were spoken. No one dared break the stillness that ensured their safety. Even the horses had quieted down, glad to be off the water and little suspecting the dangerous ground they approached. Matt knew that surprise was essential for their survival. He remembered reading that while the tough, professional German soldiers slept off a night of Christmas celebrations in Trenton, Washington's men would be creeping along the river and then turn inward to surprise the enemy, just as dawn broke. As their boat emptied out, the boys stretched their legs. It had been a cramped voyage, for the boat had been filled to capacity before they came aboard. The last remaining soldier shook hands with Corporal Hibbs. Matt watched as the young rebel stood and hugged his fellow soldier goodbye. Godspeed, Thomas, Adam Hibbs whispered. Both soldiers looked to be about the same age, and Matt wondered if they had been friends long. He imagined they had been through a great deal of hardship together, for he could feel the sadness and fear at this parting. It was a parting all of them knew could well be their last. Katie, who had slept through the entire voyage, suddenly turned in her sleep, throwing off part of the cape that covered her. Looking down, Matt remembered the general. His cape! He'll need his cape, Matt thought as he hurriedly unsnapped his down vest. He took off the vest and then lifted Katie out of the cape and into Q's arms. He shook the wet vest over the side of the boat and then wrapped it around Katie, trying to keep the dry side of the vest close to her. Then he turned to Adam Hibbs. The general forgot this, he said, holding the cape in his arms. He'll need it for the march, won't he? Adam Hibbs frowned. All the soldiers had left the boat, and the oarsmen that remained were given orders not to leave their craft. The young corporal knew that his responsibility was to guard over the children, but he also knew that the general should have his cape. All right, you take it to him, but straight away and don't tarry. I'll be keeping an eye on you from here, he warned. Matt looked back at Q, Tony, and Hooter. He couldn't believe his luck. He felt that in a way he was taking part in the revolution. He was returning the mighty general's cape. He had been given the responsibility for keeping the father of our country from freezing. He climbed out of the boat feeling like a true rebel. Matt was glad he had worn his old hooded blue sweatshirt rather than the new red one his mother had wanted him to wear. They would have thought I was a redcoat for sure, he thought, making his way through the group of soldiers that were on the shore. As he walked along, Matt noticed that each regiment seemed to have a different uniform, and they weren't all blue. There were soldiers in blue, green, brown, and beige coats. Some wore three-cornered hats, while others had round felt hats with feathers. Still others wore headbands with the words Liberty or Death stitched on them. He now understood why this new American army was called Washington's ragtag band of rebels. However, in spite of their unprofessional look, Matt marveled at the soldiers' determination. Many of them wore only linen shirts and pants that were tattered and frayed at the knees. A great number were in rags wrapped around their heads or legs and feet. In every group 2 or 3 men stood coughing, their thin frames shaking as they clutched their chests in pain. As Matt came close, he could smell the sweat and dirt of clothing that hadn't been washed in weeks or months. Yet even in these miserable conditions, Matt could feel the excitement in the air. The silence of the ragged rebel army could not conceal their hope and joy. They had trusted their leader, and he had not let them down. General Washington had gotten them across the treacherous Delaware, as he had promised, a feat the Hessian mercenaries would not even attempt. Matt could almost taste the rebels' determination, and he felt proud to be walking among them. He pretended that he was one of them, as he made his way up to the group of officers that was surrounding the general. He tried to inch his way into the huddle, when a large hand was suddenly on his neck. "Just where would you be going now, lad?" a heavy-set captain whispered. He was holding Matt by the back of his sweatshirt and had lifted him off the ground. "The general's cape. I'm to give him his cape, Matt sputtered. The general's busy conferring with his officers, but give it here and I'll see that he gets it, the captain said, reaching for the cape. He had thick, wild eyebrows that were frozen in different directions, giving him the look of a madman. Matt didn't argue. He was about to turn and head back to the boat when the captain grabbed him by the arm. Come now, son, you don't look old enough to hold a musket. Just what regiment would you be with? The captain had his face close to Matt's, and Matt could smell his sour rum breath. Regiment? I'm from the boat. I have to get back to the boat, Matt pleaded, trying to back away. No, we'll not be returning to the boats tonight, the captain shook his head. Tonight, I'll wager, we'll be sweeping these Hessian pigs off the streets of Trenton. He tightened his grip on Matt and was leading him away from the shore. But Corporal Hibbs, I'm to return to the boat with Corporal Hibbs, Matt cried. Hush now, lad, the captain whispered, pulling Matt along. This is no time for turning back. You wouldn't want to let the general down now, would you? But, Matt stammered. Hush now, the captain put his hand over Matt's mouth. As they passed a flatboat that was being uploaded onto the shore, the captain reached in and pulled out a musket and a cartridge box from a pile of guns. He shoved it into Matt's hands. Aye now, don't you look the rebel terror. He laughed under his breath. Matt felt the heavy weight of the musket in his hands. He looked down at the cold-pointed spike of the bayonet, and he was suddenly filled with terror. They couldn't think that he would know how to use this. This was all a mistake. He wasn't a rebel. He was just a kid from the 20th century who lived in a condo and watched TV and ate food that was cooked in a microwave. What did he know about bayonets and Hessian pigs? He turned his head, straining to see down the shoreline. Where was Adam Hibbs? Why hadn't he come after him? The march to Trenton was to be a silent one. Many of the farmers and citizens along the Jersey side of the Delaware were known to be loyal to King George. If they were to stay alive, the rebels would have to make the 9-mile hike as soundlessly as they could. It was due to this enforced silence that the word of the accident that befell a certain Corporal Hibbs never reached most men. As they marched noiselessly over the frozen ground, most of his comrades were unaware that Adam Hibbs lay bleeding, with his head resting in Hooter Melrose's lap. It seems the young corporal had been standing in a boat looking up the shore when he stumbled and fell onto his bayonet. They had sent him back across the river with the children to McConkey's Inn. A Corporal Neely accompanied them, as Adam Hibbs was not expected to live the night. But Matthew Carleton knew none of this. All he knew was that he had somehow gotten himself into what had once been just a daydream. He was a rebel soldier in the middle of the Revolutionary War. Only now that the daydream had come true, it seemed more like a nightmare. Chapter 10. They're going to walk all the way to Trenton. 9 miles. I'll never be able to walk 9 miles in the storm. I'm freezing. Matt curled his half-frozen fingers around the musket. He had taken the cartridge box and put the strap over his head, wearing it under his arm as he had seen the other soldiers do. Without his down vest, the wind seemed to cut right through him. His nose had begun to run and wouldn't stop. His toes ached with the cold inside of his sneakers. He thought about turning around and trying to run, but he was afraid he would be taken for a spy, or worse yet, a coward. Where is Adam Hibbs, he wondered, and what will Katie think when she wakes up without me? I wonder if I'll ever see her or the guys again. I've got to get back to them, but how? His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by Captain McCallie, who, after giving the cape to one of the general's aides, had stopped at a fence row. A group of soldiers were pulling the rails and had begun to build small fires to keep from freezing when the captain ordered them to stop. There will be no fires, he commanded. The men took the boards and used them to sit on instead. Many of the soldiers slept as they sat upright, while some took to whispering, their voices lost in the howling wind. Matt laid his musket on the ground and began pulling on a board, but it wouldn't budge. He felt embarrassed by his weak attempts to pry the board loose. Finally, a young rebel in rags leaned over and helped him to pry it free. Both he and Matt fell backwards as the board came loose in their hands. They quickly got up and carried the board to a clearing. In silence, they sat down beside one another, hugging their knees to their chests to keep warm. The soldier couldn't have been more than 14 or 15 years old, yet there were dark circles under his eyes, giving him a haggard look of exhaustion. His face was blotchy with a rash that seemed to spread up from his neck. He was just about to close his eyes when he noticed Matt's footwear. With a quizzical look, he inched closer and touched Matt's sneaker. Matt watched as a long fingernail caked with dirt lightly traced the red letters on his ankle. Reeboks, Matt whispered. Redcoats, the young rebel quickly removed his hand. No, not redcoats. These are Reeboks. You know, sneakers. Sneakers? The rebel looked wary. Oh, I guess you don't know. They're special shoes made of rubber, Matt whispered. But the soldier didn't seem to understand. He surveyed Matt's sweatshirt and jeans. Where are you from? He asked. This dress is foreign to me and not of any colony I know. Matt remembered from his history report that in 1776 each colony still had a separate style of dress, and you could often tell a New York regiment from a regiment of Virginia rebels simply by the color of shirts they wore. He also knew that Nebraska was not yet a colony in 1776. He paused, thinking about his Aunt Shelley and Uncle Mark. Well, I have relatives living in Maryland, he said truthfully. The young rebel nodded, seeming to accept this. My name is Israel Gates, and truth be known, I've never been to Maryland, and I've never seen such queer dress. But queer though it be, I would offer a trade for one of those sneakers. Sneakers, Matt corrected him. I, whatever you be calling them, I would give my shirt for one. It's right warm, he whispered, offering a raggedy sleeve for Matt to feel. But why trade your shirt for one shoe? Matt didn't understand until Israel unwrapped the rags that bound his left foot. By the light of the moon, Matt could see the long gash that ran along the side of Israel's foot. It was puffy with infection and crusted with dirt. The whole foot seemed to be turning bluish-green. The pain of the wound has stopped. It's all numb, and though I'm glad for that, I'm afraid it's freezing up on me, Israel told him. Matt bit down on his lower lip at the sight of the foot, and quickly untied his sneaker. Israel began to lift his coat over his head. Matt could see that it was nothing more than an old blanket with a slit at the top and some crude stitching along the sides. No, keep your shirt, Matt whispered. I'm warm enough. He took off his sneaker and sock and offered them to Israel. What kind of stockings are these? Israel asked, feeling the soft cotton while peering down at the green stripes that went around the top of the sock. Matt couldn't help but smile. Nerd socks. That's what my friend Tony calls them. He won't wear any socks that have stripes. Israel gave Matt a strange look on hearing this, and Matt suddenly realized the luxurious life he had left behind, where you could refuse to wear a sock just because it had stripes. Israel put his foot into the sneaker with some difficulty, though he did get it in. Matt breathed a sigh of relief. Thanks, Dad, he muttered under his breath, for his mother had always said that he got his big feet from his father's side of the family. Matt suddenly thought of his father and mother, and tears came to his eyes, as he wondered if he would ever see them again. What did you say? Israel asked. Oh, I was just thinking how glad I was for once that I have such big feet for a kid, Matt said, wiping a tear from his cheek. A goat? Israel frowned. No, where I come from we call boys kids. Like I would be a regular kid, and you're older, so you would be a big kid, Matt tried to explain. Israel cocked his head and smiled slowly. Where I come from they'd be calling you a sight dim for telling a man with a musket that he's an old goat. Matt was about to explain further when he saw that Israel was laughing. I guess it does sound funny, Matt laughed as he quickly undid his other sneaker. He took off his one sock and put it on his left foot, and then replaced the sneaker on his right foot. Matt knew that he would have to keep both feet covered to keep them from freezing. He knew it wouldn't be long before his sock became wet from stepping on ice and snow, and he wondered if he would have the courage that Israel had to keep going. Israel saw the worried look on his face and silently leaned over and began to wrap Matt's left foot in the dirty linen strips that had once been around his own foot. When he was through, both the boys stretched out their legs and grinned. I don't know your name, Israel whispered, reaching into his haversack. Matthew Carlton, Matt said shyly. Well, Matthew Carlton, you've been a good friend to me, and I'll not forget it. Here, have some of this, he said, offering Matt what looked like a burnt piece of meat. Matt was starving and gratefully accepted the gift. It's good. What is it? He asked with a mouthful. Pigeon, Israel replied. I trapped one a few days before we crossed the river. I'm glad I had enough time to roast him. Pigeon? I'm eating pigeon, Matt thought with a grimace. Israel reached down and took up a handful of snow to his mouth. Would that we had a small beer to wash it down with. Now there would be a feast. A real feast, Matt said limply. Would that we had a Coke and a hamburger with a side of fries. Now that would be a feast, Matt thought to himself as he brought some snow to his mouth. It won't be long before I'll be eating regular meals again, and if we live through the next 6 days, I shall return your gift in kind, Israel told him, trying to warm his hands with his breath. My enlistment comes due the first of the year, and with my wages I can pay for the nerd stocking and shoe. Don't worry about it, Matt whispered. But what will you do when your enlistment is up? Will you sign up again and stay and fight? Israel closed his eyes and shook his head wearily. This regiment is the 12th of Massachusetts, and I don't know that many of us could re-enlist even if we wanted to. We barely got out of Montreal alive, what with the Indians and then the pox. The march to Albany killed off most of our wounded and sick, and this last march to Pennsylvania took still more. Those of us left have barely enough strength to lift our muskets. And tell me, what good will these be? He said, reaching for his gun. They're soaked after all this rain and snow, and it will surely be a miracle to get them firing. At least you have a bayonet. He pointed to Matt's musket. Oh, I know there are those that are in high spirits, because we seem to be on the offense at last. But I'll wager you won't find much cheer here. I've seen so much hardship that you could make me a general and I wouldn't re-enlist. No, he sighed. I've had enough of army life. All I want now is to get back to Massachusetts and a warm bed and a slice of hunter's pie. And besides, I've got to deliver these. He pulled out a small leather pouch from his pack, and a dozen glass beads fell into his outstretched palm. Aren't they fine? He whispered as the light of the moon bounced off the delicate painted glass. They'll make one pretty necklace, he smiled. They are pretty, Matt agreed. Who do you have to deliver them to? To one very demanding lady. Israel's blue eyes seemed to twinkle as he said this. Oh, Matt mumbled. Like a girlfriend? Girlfriend? Well, yes. She is a girl, and surely a friend, and also the fairest maid in Massachusetts. She's got a mop of gold curls and the face of an angel. Though truth be telling, she's got a devil of a temper. When she's vexed with you, she'll stamp her feet and shake her little fists. She's something to contend with, I'll guarantee. Matt moved closer to Israel. He wasn't much interested in hearing about girlfriends, but he was glad for the company, no matter what they talked about. Maybe, he thought to himself, with Israel for a friend, I'll be able to get through this march. A chilling wind swept across the clearing, and Matt hugged his knees even closer to his chest. What's your girlfriend's name? Matt asked with a shiver. Israel smiled. Abby. But I'll call her my Gabby Abby. He laughed. Not 5 years old, and she can outtalk a tinker on a Monday. 5 years old? Matt looked perplexed. She's my little sister, Israel smiled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. My mother died in birthing her, and since I was the eldest, I promised my mum that I would watch over the little ones. My father has a likeness for rum, you see. He spends most of his days in the tavern. Well then, who's looking after Abby now? Matt asked. My brothers, Israel told him. Ben is 12 years, Simon is 11, and Nathan is 8. They're good boys, but surely I hated to leave them alone. Israel's voice trailed off as he gazed up into the moon. It must have been hard for you to choose, Matt whispered. Choose? Israel's eyebrows shot up. You know, choose between your family and your country. It's what a soldier has to do, I guess. Make his country safe for his family, right? Israel shook his head and gave a low, sarcastic laugh. His voice became a husky whisper. I don't know about you, but I thought these colonies were safe enough without a war. I had no desire to be a soldier, and I wouldn't be here now if my father hadn't drank up what little coin he had managed to bring in from his tailoring. I had to keep my promise to my mother, so it was up to me to see that we didn't starve. I sold the only thing I could, and come December 31st, my debt is paid. I don't understand, Matt whispered. Israel studied his young friend's face. You remind me of my brother Simon. Bright eyes and thick head, he sighed. I sold myself as a substitute for a wealthy silversmith in Boston. I took on his enlistment papers in return for a cow and enough coin to keep my sister and brothers fed till spring. I only planned to stay till enlistment was up, but when I found myself marching on foot in Montreal with a party of Indians fast on our heels, I decided to re-enlist so I could get home under the Army's protection. And besides, they were paying $6 a month. Now I have just 6 more days to go and I can head home. He closed his eyes and smiled. Then he opened his hand and looked down at the beads again. I promised Abby a present, and so when we came across a tinker on the road to Albany, I asked to see his wares. As soon as I saw these, I knew Abby would love them. Blue is her favorite color, he said, turning the beads over in his hand. They come from France, you know. The tinker told me so. He grinned. My lieutenant was right vexed with me for spending my last pistareens on pretties. He scolded me for not buying some leather that I could have made up into some decent shoes. But I promised Abby I'd bring her back the prettiest present I could find, and it was my last bit of coin. Many a tinker and shopkeeper won't take the paper we're paid. They don't believe the continental currency is worth anything. But then you must know that. Though in truth you don't look old enough to count your wages, much less earn them. How did you come to enlist? Um, Matt squirmed, trying not to look at Israel. The truth is, I didn't enlist, and you're right, I'm not old enough. It was an accident. You see, I got separated from my friends and sister. I have a little sister, too. Her name is Katie. Anyway, I was sleeping in a friend's house, and I thought we could have an adventure, and so we went for this walk after my friend's parents went to sleep, and then... His voice was beginning to crack as he tried to hold back the tears. I don't know how this happened, how we ended up here. I never knew it would be like this. I'm not from here, Israel. You have to believe me. I'm from another... It's all right, Israel interrupted him, leaning over and putting his arm around him. I'll look after you. We two goats, we'll get through this together. You'll see. And when my enlistment is up, we'll find your Katie, and you and she can come and visit me and Abby and the boys. Don't worry, Matthew Carlton. You've got a friend in Israel Gates. You can depend on it.